Okay, this tutorial is on applying surface texture. What I have here is an illustration that I'm currently working on where I'm taking advantage of this function in Corel Painter. The best example in this illustration, you can see, I'll go ahead and zoom in here. The best example here is Little Red Riding Hood. You can actually see the canvas paper very clear here, and the same thing with the wolf. You can see a really nice kind of watercolor texture that I applied there. And I kind of emphasized that with the lighting and the controls in the apply surface texture control. Okay, this is just an image of some kind of random brush strokes. To begin with, when you apply the texture, just go to Effects, go to Surface Control, and apply Surface Texture. And it'll bring up this dialog box, and you basically have kind of 4 different options in the very beginning as far as like what texture you want to play around with, what texture you want to kind of tweak and change a little bit. The first one is paper, and currently I'm on the small dot paper. You could pick from any one of these. If you want to switch papers, you can kind of see it change as we go through in the little preview here. And then you could also pick the brush strokes, the 3D brush strokes. Basically what this will do is this will kind of emphasize the brush strokes that you're working with. In some cases you're not really going to see much of a change at all, and you can change the amount of it with here. So if you just want a little bit of it to show, just keep it down here. If you really want to emphasize those brush strokes, you keep it up. And you will be able to see the paper as well, because obviously the paper is going to affect the brush strokes. And we can go down to image illuminance. And this basically kind of breaks down the painting just into black and white. So if you can almost imagine this as just like a grayscale, it breaks it down into black and white as far as like figuring out the the height and the depth of it. Just kind of breaks it down into like really big shapes. So it's not really breaking down the brush strokes, it's playing around with the shapes in general. One thing you want to watch out for with image luminance and also original luminance is, and original luminance is basically just the image itself. It's not really breaking it down into a grayscale, it's just breaking it down into shapes to begin with. Both of these are pretty similar and also kind of tricky to get the hang of. The ones that I tend to use quite a bit is the paper and the 3D brush strokes. One thing I will say with image luminance and original luminance is occasionally if you've like restarted Painter anytime recently, or you just opened it up, if you click on image luminance and all of a sudden you get this weirdly weird almost like flower pattern on there, and sometimes this will also happen with the image luminance. In this case it isn't. That's the default clone source that Painter has. Lots of times you'll see this weird kind of flower pattern like pull up when you're cloning something, or in this case you're kind of cloning it. You're actually you're attempting to clone the brush strokes here, but occasionally this will show up. What you want to do if that does happen is go ahead and kind of cancel out of that and go to File, go to Clone Source, and you can see it's on Current Pattern. By default it's always on that hens and chicks pattern, which is located right down in here. You can see the hens and chicks. And I'll bring that up so you can actually see what's going on here. So this is the hens and chicks pattern that I'm talking about. So occasionally this will show up when you're either trying to clone something, or in our case when we are actually trying to kind of exaggerate the texture of one of the paintings that we are working on. So occasionally this image will show up, or sometimes you'll see this like flower pattern show up. If that happens and you don't want it to happen, go ahead and go to File, go to Clone Source, and make sure that it's on whichever clone source you want it to be on. So if you have it on the current pattern, it's going to do the hens and chicks. It automatically goes to that as default. Just wanted to show you that pattern in case you see it show up and it just confuses the hell out of you. Just go to Clone Source and make sure it's on the actual source that you're trying to make a clone of or change the texture of or whatever. Just for variety, I'll switch to Paisley pattern, one that I kind of created myself. And you have all these little options as far as like how to alter it. You can alter the softness of it. going from left to right there. You can alter the amount of it, which is probably the biggest control you really want to pay attention to. And generally I wouldn't do it all the way out to here. It's just going to look a little ridiculous once you actually click OK and see the whole thing there. It looks really cool here, but when you see the whole thing it looks a little ridiculous. So I usually have it almost right around here so you can just kind of barely make it out. The actual picture itself, if you bring it all the way down to here, it basically just makes it into black paper. With the actual texture of the paper on there and not any of the image whatsoever. So I would generally leave that to 100, and then you can also play around with the shine of it, which is also very similar to the reflection of it. Generally I would also have these very, very low down, especially the reflection and not so much the shine. The shine you can kind of play around with a little bit, but if you get it all the way over here, it looks just a bit too much. And then you also have some lighting controls here. There's actually another menu for lighting controls. This just kind of breaks it down very simply. And you can move this around to affect the lighting there. And you can also increase or decrease the brightness of it. And you can also increase or decrease the actual the strength of the light in a way, the actual ball itself, like if this was a sun rotating around a planet or whatever. And then you can also kind of play around with the exposure of it. I generally don't play around with this too much because there's another window all in itself that can play around with lighting controls, and that's the one that I would probably use for that. You can also, if you don't want to rotate it around here, what you can do is you can actually pick your light source from here, which I find really helpful because if you get the light source like way over here, all of a sudden it's going to get a little bit too dark. So I generally kind of stick to these because I think it's just a lot easier to use and you're not going to totally lose your image. These are some brush strokes that I did with the acrylic brushes. And even with really playing around with the amount, some of them you really can't really tell that much. These brush strokes right here, the kind of orangish brush strokes, were done with a very, very soft brush that had very little texture to begin with. And then versus these that were done with the opaque, thick brush strokes. And you can really already see quite a bit of texture there. So when I'm playing around with the amount, it really kind of gets out of control. I'll go ahead and kind of put it all the way up to here so you can see that you're almost like making like three-dimensional objects with it to the point where they actually have kind of like a drop shadow there. There we go. Looks kind of 80s-ish, and it literally kind of gives them a drop shadow, so you can really make your brush strokes really look three-dimensional. In most cases, you're not necessarily going to want this to be, this severe. So I'll go ahead and backspace, and I'll just put that down a little bit more. Actually, quite a bit more. I'll just put it down to like maybe 17%. So there we go. It just pumps them out a little bit, but not to the point where it doesn't really look too artificial. And you can do really nice kind of combinations of maybe pumping up the brush strokes and also at the same time maybe kind of showing a little bit more of the actual paper that you're working with. So if you really want to make it look like a painting, you can kind of play around with the paper, and I'll go ahead and kind of bring this down a little bit more. It's very subtle. Click OK. And now it looks like we have kind of rather thick brush strokes on canvas.